All right, hey everybody, welcome. Tonight we're going to talk about winemaking basics featuring the viticulture side of winemaking, and this is for our Vidi 308 winemaking class, of course. So winemaking can be extremely overwhelming. It may seem really complex, but the reason that wine has been made for so many years and for so long is because it's something that just kind of happens naturally to grapes or fruit that's kind of left to its own, basically in a bucket or a barrel or something. So winemaking at its simplest is you take the grapes, you can add yeast or not, and then it ferments. And then you remove the solids, which is also known as pumice, and then you basically drink the wine. So it's a fermented fruit product. Sugar is converted into alcohol, and then it's just kind of enjoyed. And sometimes it's still sweet, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not, right? But that is winemaking at the very tip of the iceberg, right? So when we think about the process, just expand it out a little more, right? It's the process of converting sugar to alcohol by fermenting wine grapes specifically. And for white wine, we receive the grapes, we crush and destem them, press, we ferment the juice on its own, then we can fine and filter, right? And we'll talk about fining, what that means as we go on with this class, right? That's the process for white wine. For red wine, you receive the grapes, you crush and destem, you ferment with the skins. That's what gives it its lovely color. Then you would press, ferment it again, and then age, fine, and filter. Those are kind of the very general steps for white and red winemaking. I do have a link here from YouTube showing some graphics about how wine is made. And then we also have an article from Wine Magazine that talks about the steps in red winemaking as well, if you would like to see that. If you're a visual learner, it kind of helps. So if you're interested in becoming a winemaker, there's a lot of questions that are involved. I mean, if you're making wine from home and it's not a business, if you're not trying to be a winemaker for a business, I mean, then you have a lot more freedoms, of course. But if you'd like to pursue this as a career, there are things you have to consider too, right? Generally speaking, if you're a winemaker, whether it's for a career, commercial, or for home, for personal use, there's things that you'd have to ask yourself to determine, what's our plan with this wine, right? It's like, what wine do I want to make? What do I want it to cost, right? You can buy all these fancy equipment and you can buy all these fancy additives to wine, but it's like at the end of the day, it's like, what am I willing to spend on this product to make it happen, right? What characteristics do I want and not want, right? Do I want it to be fruity? Do I want it to be earthy? Do I want it to be oaked? All these things that we'd have to have an idea. And you'd have to have a basis of knowledge of wine tasting and wine in general before diving into this, right? Other things to consider are like, what are the risks of this? Do I want to control them? What are the flavor consequences of each decision that I make? And are these flavors desirable or undesirable in the final wine, right? So having a broad understanding of wine itself, but also the microbiology, the fermentation that's involved, the chemistry that's involved with the stability, and how every decision you make impacts the wine, and it just kind of develops these layers upon layers upon layers until you have a final product that people or just yourself will enjoy, right? So that's why winemaking it's a combination of multiple sciences put together. So when we ask ourselves, how do I even start with this? There are 4 general things in the winemaking world of where the flavor of the wine comes from. So something that always used to happen, in tasting rooms is people be like, oh, well, the tasting note on this wine is Fuji apples. And they're like, well, did you put apples in the wine? And it's like, no, we don't do that. It actually comes from the grape itself. So people get very confused sometimes, but it's important to know if you're going to be a winemaker or a sommelier or a viticulturist, where does that flavor in the wine actually come from? So there's 4 different things. There's the grape itself, the activity of microorganisms, your processing choices, and also aging. So there's a star on the slide because it's very important that you memorize these things and you can list and explain the 4 different components where wine flavor comes from. So first we have the grape itself. So this depends on the grape variety. So if you're talking Barbera versus Tempranillo versus Cabernet Sauvignon, very different varieties just based off of that, right? Then we have the clone. So even within just Tempranillo, there are numerous different clones of Tempranillo that will produce slightly different flavors. They will grow at slightly different times. Maybe one's more earthy, one's more fruity, and one's more acidic, right? So just that as well as another layer of complexity. The rootstocks, soil, canopy management, the terrain, pest pressure, disease pressure, the climate that it's grown in, all of these things, these vineyard practices come together and it impacts how the grape is going to taste. This is one of the leading components of the concept of terroir, which is a French term meaning a sense of place, right? So when you consume a product, particularly wine, in the example of terroir, it is a representation, it's a sense of place of where it was grown. Number 2, for flavors and aromas in wine, a lot of it does come from activity of microorganisms. So the yeast and bacteria that transform these chemical components in a wine also develop and influence the flavors that are there too. So the main yeast that we use in winemaking is Saccharomyces cerevisiae. So Saccharomyces and other yeast, that is the yeast that's converting sugar into alcohol, of course. It's the most prominently used yeast in the industry for wine, but it's also used in beer and baking and much other things as well. This is what it looks like. This is an up-close photo at 5 micrometers, which is pretty cool. Then we also have bacteria that we use in the wine industry as well. So we have lactic acid bacteria, which ferments glucose into lactic acid, which can make wine taste sour. We also have grape flora, winery flora, and whatever inocula you end up choosing, right? So the grape and winery flora is just the native ambient yeast that is in the area. So even if you were to just crush up some grapes and leave it in a cup in your winery, it would start fermenting because there's ambient yeast in the air that exists everywhere you go. Okay, number 3 is processing decisions. So these heavily impact wine character as well. So this could be your harvesting conditions. If you choose to harvest, in the rain or during the day, during the night, right? The fruit comes in hot or cold or wet. This will impact the wine, of course. The decisions, a lot of this is like the decisions that the winemaker and or grape grower make on the wine and how it impacts it. So maceration choices is the time spent with the skins. So if you do a short maceration, extended maceration, the more time the skins spend on the juice, the more flavors and aromas it will be extracting from that, right? We also have whatever additions a winemaker decides to add to the juice or must. The fermentation conditions, did it ferment hot? Did it ferment cold? The lees contact, that's the leftover yeast and bacteria from the fermentation that forms this layer on the bottom of the tank. It can be stirred up in sort of a surly or bâtonnage style where it can help enhance the mouthfeel, or you can not do that, right? You don't have to do that. Also, if you choose to clarify, filter, fine your wines, any blending that you do, any stabilization treatments, this will all impact wine character greatly, right? So I like to think of this section as like any decision that the winemaker makes once the grapes have come in. This is one of the big ones that alters the flavors. Aging decisions are also under the winemaking scope, along with like adding yeast, right? So I guess you could say just about everything, right, the winemaker and grape grower has a hand in, but a lot of it is just kind of like, it's this concept of like nature versus nurture, right? It's the surrounding nature of the vineyard provides these characteristics, and then how we nurture the wine produces these characteristics, and the final product is how those mingle together at the end, right? So for aging decisions impacting wine character, we just have basically all the components of how you treated that wine after it was finished fermenting. So the time, how long you decide to age the wine, the temperature of the aging process, the cooperage, so like the barrel that you're choosing, right? The pH of the wine, the overall wine composition, how much it evaporates, if you agitate it during aging, oxygen exposure, lees exposure, and just overall sanitation practices, right? So all these can impact wine character. So this is a gentleman topping up a barrel of wine. Wine does evaporate from barrels as it ages. It's a very natural process. It does kind of evaporate through the pores of the wooden barrels. What he's doing is called topping a wine barrel, and he is spilling a little bit of wine on the barrel, but that's very common. Some folks could just use a funnel as well if they were concerned about that. But as the wine evaporates, the level of wine lowers in the barrel, right? So a lot like this picture here where you see this gap of air. If you would like to protect your wine, you'd need to fill that space up with more wine, which is called topping. You're topping off the barrel. In the case of this barrel in the bottom right picture, this is sherry. So this is a specific style of winemaking where they actually purposefully expose part of the wine to oxygen, and then this yeast forms on the top layer of the wine. This is called flor yeast, so F-L-O-R, flor. And this is what produces kind of like those sherry-like characters. So like caramel, apple components, right? So this is specifically sherry winemaking practices. Okay, so that's a little bit of background. We're going to dive into the viticulture component because it is important to understand the vineyard side of things if you want to be a good winemaker, right? And also just general information for this class for your knowledge, right? So what type of grapevines do we use? We generally use Vitis vinifera. When we talk about Vitis vinifera, this just grapevines that originate from Europe, right? And these are some of the best wine grapes that we have. So like Grenache, Cabernet Sauvignon, Tempranillo, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be just France or Italy or whatever. It's just generally European, so not United States, right? We do have American grape varieties, and this includes Vitis labrusca, Vitis riparia, Vitis rotundifolia. These are varieties that are native to our soil, and the reason that these ones are important is because they are resistant to the pests on our side of the pond, basically, right? So phylloxera, nematodes, all these things. These vines do produce their own fruit, and you could make wine from it. We've tried. It's not very good. So the species are hardy. They're great for what we call the rootstock. That's the bottom portion of the vine because they protect the vine from all of the insects that we have, basically, right? The pests in the soil. We treat the upper portion. We do what's called grafting, right? We take the lower portion as the rootstock, and then the upper part is like the scion and the part that grows. The upper portion is typically the Vitis vinifera, the European grapevine component, and that's what produces the wonderful wine, whereas the rootstock is the American component, which protects the vine, right? So that's why most of vines that you see in the United States are grafted. Also, most vines in a lot of European areas are also grafted because, unfortunately, during the time period when we were moving around vines and agricultural products, unfortunately, we transferred a lot of pests with that in the process. This was before, we had screening and the USDA involved with this, right? So we had actually given phylloxera to Europe a long time ago, and it was a huge outbreak, and it spread like wildfire, and a lot of their famous historic old vineyards died because of that. So a lot of those vines are also grafted as well now. There are also like specialty rootstocks. There's like a whole breeding program and research centered around providing, rootstocks that will help vines with current day problems. So like rootstocks that are drought resistant, right? Rootstocks that are resistant to maybe heavy clay soils. Maybe it's a rootstock that can handle high saturation of water. Maybe you want to try to plant vines somewhere like near a swamp, something like that. Like there's different components, right? So breeding programs come into play. So when you purchase vines, you'll hear some things like 10114, 1103P, 3309. So some of these like numbers and acronyms come into play, and that's just the specific number of that rootstock, generally speaking. But they were derived from the common American grape varieties like Vitis labrusca, Vitis riparia, right? So they create crosses and then try to find something genetically helpful to current day problems. Okay. This brings up another really important point for the viticulture side, is the difference between a variety versus a clone. So new varieties are produced by sexual reproduction, right? So Cabernet Franc and Sauvignon Blanc crossed to create Cabernet Sauvignon. And this happened through the pollen of one plant pollinating the flower of another plant, right? And then there was a genetic transfer. You go back to your like Punnett squares, right? And then it produced a new offspring with a combination of genetics through its parents, right? This can happen on accident. We can do this in breeding programs on purpose, right? Interestingly enough, grapevines are hermaphroditic. They have both male and female parts on their flowers, and they don't require insects or anything to pollinate them. They kind of self-pollinate through the wind. So what you would do is you would trim all the male parts off of one, and then you would take, one male versus one female, and then you'd cross there, right? So that's how you create a new variety. If you were to create clones, right, or I'd say if you want to propagate, you would take a cutting off of a vine and then you'd plant it, right? And any cutting you take off a vine and you develop new roots, you graft it onto something, so it still has the exact same genetic makeup as the parent plant. It's a propagation, so those are all the same clone. If you wanted to create new clones, right, so different from each other, so say like there are, the classic example is Pinot Noir, Pinot Gris, and Pinot Blanc. These grapevines are actually, we call them out as if they're varieties, but they're actually clones of each other. So Pinot Noir, Pinot Gris, and Pinot Blanc are all genetically exactly the same, except there is a mutation that was caused by an environmental stress or like a deletion of a genetic code or something that changed the skin color of the grape. So Pinot Noir is a red grape variety. Pinot Gris actually has a gray colored skin to it, and Pinot Blanc is a white or green skinned variety, right? So they all look exactly the same besides that one component. Because the skin color is different, they're utilized for very different wines, basically, right? So the big takeaway is if you wanted how different clones are made, so subsets, so like say for Cabernet Sauvignon, say we have 4 different clones of Cabernet Sauvignon. How those occurred was through a mutation. So it was a trigger through stress in the environment, just being in a different environment, pest pressures, disease pressures, or sometimes they just happen randomly, right? That's the thing with mutations. They're kind of crazy like that. If you would like to read more, if you feel like this is really confusing, I have a good article from Testarossa about grape clones specifically. But this is a really important concept to understand. This will definitely be on the quiz. So if you have any questions, if you're just having a hard time, feel free to send me an email. Okay, now we're going to talk about characteristics of plants. This is important because this is one of the reasons that we see like the things that we do in winemaking is because plants have to respond to their environment in different ways than we do because they're rooted into place, right? They have different procedures, different methods, different strategies, right? So because of this, there's a lot of chemical strategies that plants use. So this involves using chemicals to help with nutrient limitation, competition from other plants, excess or shortage of water, extremes of temperature, disease and pest pressure, and also lack of light. This applies to all plants, not just grapevines, of course, right? And one of the things that we see up here in this corner is phototropism. It's when a plant can't get the light that it requires, but it senses it like just within reach. It will actually grow in the direction that the light has, right? And then as far as like nutrient limitation and competition, so say we have two different species of plants, or in this case we have two trees. We have a Douglas fir, and then we have, this looks like a birch tree. There's actually a network of mycorrhizae that's a fungus that grows in the soil, and it's a beneficial and like collaborative species that hooks onto the roots of these plants, and it's a network that communicates. So say one tree is really stressed and doesn't have nutrients, it'll actually move that fungi will move nutrients from somewhere else to aid that plant, right? So it's a mutual beneficial relationship, which is really crazy. So just because they're plants and they're stuck in place doesn't mean that they don't have a complex system to overcome situations, right? It's really quite fascinating. Another interesting characteristic of plants that we have to keep in mind is that their first priority in this world is to reproduce. They, produce seeds, they produce to spread their genetics, right? But also around that, they'll produce like a fruit. Maybe they have a really pretty color to attract animals, right? Maybe they started to develop sugar, so they'd be sweet, so animals would really enjoy them, right? So that's their first priority, is to produce fruit, disperse their seeds. The seed itself is engineered in such a way that's really bizarre and interesting, where the seed is coated with indigestible compounds. So that way it's actually meant to go through the digestive tract of an animal and survive. And then once it's pooped out, right, it actually can be like integrated into the soil, and then it will actually sprout from there. So that is how it spreads its genetics, which is pretty crazy. This actually like applies a lot to grapevines, because oftentimes grapevines will produce way more fruit than it should, because its priority is to reproduce and not make fantastic balanced wine. So oftentimes we'll have to go through the vineyard and we have to do what's called dropping crop. We'll have to actually drop clusters, so that way, and balance the vine ourselves, so that way the vine can ripen the fruit to the sugar content level that we want it to produce the style of wine that we're looking for. So that is very common. Grapevines specifically are kind of like monsters of plants. They're known to be what we call like structural parasites, which means that they'll climb any structure. They grow very quickly. They compete for light, for nutrients, for water, and they'll just kind of take over whatever structure is near them. They also grow in a wide variety of soils and climates. They are extremely persistent in nutrient-deficient soils. The crop set does happen in the previous season. So after the fruit is harvested, there's actually on the shoots, there's already buds on them that will be the new shoots and new clusters for next year, which is pretty crazy. This is because they have these dormant buds that are developmentally programmed during that season. Also, the root structure of a grapevine is very intensive. It could be up to 90% of the vine mass, depending on how incentivized that vine has been to look for water, right? And also the ability to, right, if the soil is, penetratable enough, it'll just keep getting deeper and deeper. It needs to get any water and nutrients to survive. As far as soil goes, there's 3 different types of soil around the world. There's clay, silt, and sand. And then there are like derivatives of soil and how they are formed, but these are the 3 types based off of like pore size. So clay is the finest soil, right? That's why it holds on to so much water. Then we have silt, that is more of like a medium size, and then we have sand, which is the largest size kind of like piece, and a combination of these things form the soil type. So there's just clay loam, sandy clay loam, silty clay loam. Different percentages of these things come together, and if you follow this triangle, you can discover what your percentage is, right? So the soil impacts your grapevine performance depending on what type of soil you have. If it's rocky, the nutrient composition of the soil, the porosity, is it super compacted? The location or topography will impact the grapevine performance. Is it a hillside, a valley floor? Are you trying to plant next to a golf course that gets too much water, right? Disease and pest pressure also play a component. So this could impact, of course, the composition and quality of your fruit, right? So if you have some kind of pest that's eating up your grapevines, that's going to impact the performance. So another component to think about with dirt is not just the soil composition, but we think about the water holding capacity. Are my vines going to have enough water to get through the season? Do I need to irrigate? How much does irrigation cost? Do I want to consider that as an option, right? Also, depending on the composition of your soil, there is a whole discussion about, okay, it might have these nutrients, but are these nutrients actually available to the plant, right? The pH, salinity, balance of nutrients will all impact what ones are actually available to your grapevine. There's also like a whole conversation around how soil itself, how you need to farm the soil. We can't just spread all these crazy toxic chemicals and scorch the earth and expect our agriculture to do well. We have to promote good fungi, good bacteria. There's a whole underground system of insects and bugs that help the porosity, help the structure of the soil overall, going to prevent any type of erosion. So there's a lot that goes into soil science that we don't always realize, right? We just think, I have a grapevine, I'm going to plant it, and it's going to make fruit, and it's going to be good. And that's oftentimes the end of the conversation, but there's a lot more to discuss. Other factors that would impact your grapevine performance would be your climate, right? So the temperature of your growing season, how much sunshine do you get? Is it humid? How much rainfall do you get? How much wind, water availability? There's also microclimate. So speaking of like the canopy of the vine specifically for a microclimate, and the heating of your vineyard floor, climate of individual clusters like shading, humidity retention. So there's a lot that goes into this that we often don't consider. There's also human decision making that will impact your performance. So your irrigation practices, use of fertilizers, your timing of treatments, canopy management, your trellising system, your use of rootstocks, pruning practices, and then leaf removal, dropping of fruit. I know this list is like very extensive and exhausting, but sometimes we just write off agriculture like it's some kind of simple thing, but there's so many components that are a part of it that when you actually do visit or see a vineyard that's so well manicured and produces such good fruit, you really do appreciate it. So, very important. There's also different types of philosophies behind farming and viticultural practices. So we have just like conventional farming, which does use integrated pest management, also referred to as IPM, preventative cultural practices, and a combination of synthetic pesticides and biological control practices. So that's conventional. There's also dry farming, which is a method of farming that conserves water by not irrigating your vines at all. This really relies on the total rainfall, the water holding capacity of your soil, and if your vines can make it through the season through that. Organic farming is grapes grown without the use of pesticides, synthetic fertilizers, or herbicides. It's very expensive to be certified organic, but you do get to put that seal on your bottle. So that's very important to consumers when they purchase. You can have that as part of your marketing. Biodynamic is kind of it's a spiritual, ethical, ecological approach to agriculture. If you want to be biodynamic certified, you can go through Demeter, which is a farm and product like directory, but also like an organization that helps to certify people, right? Demeter is a reference to the Greek goddess of the harvest, which is pretty cool. There are a lot of things for biodynamic farming that overlap with organic. But there are some other components too, like such as burying goat horns filled with crystals or manure in your vineyard, like creating teas, like using different herbs and medicines, and then soaking it in water to create like your own type of fertilizer or like insecticide. So it's very interesting. And these are all links if you'd like to look into any of these, right? Then we also have reasoned and sustainable farming. This is the type of farming that focuses on protecting the environment with aiding and expanding natural resources, right? So not using gas when you don't have to, using natural resources that are renewable instead of non-renewable sources of energy, right? And last but not least, we have fish-friendly farming, which is a sustainable certification that restores fish and wildlife habitat and improves water quality. You'd be surprised how much of a problem like runoff is for like pesticides, wine products, juice products that affect the pH of these streams and ecosystems. So this is just a list of some of the most commonly spoken practices. It's by no means the exclusive list. I'm sure there's more out there. Okay. As far as the development and maturity of your grapes, there's different factors for that too. So the grape variety itself, these just mature at different times. So like right now, we're bringing in our white grape varieties from Boger. Our reds won't be later until a couple weeks. They just ripen later. There's also disease and pest pressure. This can alter your composition of the fruit, alter the timing of development. If you have a hot or cold climate, that will affect when your harvest will be as well, and the levels of sugar and acid. And then also vine balance. We talked about dropping crop a couple slides ago. This is a balance between making sure that the vine isn't overproducing fruit, that it can't, that doesn't have the energy to ripen all of, right? So you would essentially drop crop to cut back the load of that grapevine so that way it's only ripening what a load that it can handle, basically. And here's a picture of that on the right here. This is Zinfandel at Boger Winery. And you can see this is just about at veraison where the berries start turning color. They go from green to purple. And we've gone through and we've actually thinned about 50% of this just because Zinfandel is a very vigorous variety. It just tends to overproduce. So, and based off of our experience, we know how much to drop. It's a very personal number. It takes some fidgeting around with. But you can see all the clusters left on the ground. It is very sad, but ultimately it's producing a better quality wine. Okay, here we have a representation of what optimal ripening of grapes is compared to unoptimal situations, right? So this top picture here, we have a graph of here are the berries, how they look like through their development. They start very green and hard, and they start to expand with water. They soften, they turn colors, they develop sugars, the acids drop, and then they start to form flavor and aroma compounds in the skins. As you can see, the sugar grows over time, the acid depletes over time, right around veraison, and then the flavor potential doesn't really spike until right before you pick it, right? And when you pick your fruit, there are like ideal ratios of sugar to acid. It's like very hard to make good quality wine if these ratios are off. So that sugar eventually becomes alcohol, right? And then that acid plays a component in the structure and health of the wine, but also like the structure and the taste as well. So if you have sugar acids too high, sugar's too high and acid's too low, you'll have to add water back and then add more acid to go into it. So now you're just throwing things around, and it's just an unideal ripening situation in general, right? So if your climate conditions were to suddenly change due to climate change in general or whatever, right, this could affect your crop and it could affect the quality of the wine that you're making. So something to consider. And at long last, we have reached our review questions. So I would review these questions before taking the quiz. If you have any questions, of course, feel free to email me. But I hope that was helpful, and I look forward to seeing you guys in class soon.